I guess being the sixth speaker, some of my thunder has already been stolen, so bear with me, and I hope that it still hangs together okay and I can illuminate some more of Bean. When the Sydney Morning Herald sent Charles Bean to the outback in 1909 to report on the wool industry, he had a chance meeting with an Afghan camel driver on the banks of the Darling River. By way of conversation, Bean remarked that it must be easy to make money here, going so far as to suggest that he must look upon Australia as a sort of peaceful, plentiful paradise to escape from the trials of his own native land. But the Afghan was affronted. He agreed he could make money here, but pointing to the camel camp, he added, "What is the use of this life? This is not life." Bean looked anew at the miserable hole where the benighted heathen camped, dust and camel dung everywhere. The only sign of civilisation were the rusty kerosene tins being used as humpies. Cameleer, with shining eyes, described the rye and wheat in the mountain valley where he grew up in Afghanistan, and there was no mistaking the mixture of pride and longing in his tone. Bean immediately regretted his comments, but unable to explain himself, he just listened, chastened. He knew he had hurt the Afghan's feelings. Bean had been taught to think about race in the context of a European philosophical divide between East and West. The Cameleer saw his society in Afghanistan as superior. This was an alternative worldview. A seed of doubt, a very little seed, I hasten to add, was sown about views Bean had heretofore taken for granted. What this anecdote does suggest is that Bean had the capacity to acknowledge his own view of the world and challenge it. Over his life, this capacity served him well. To explore whence this came, it is necessary to look at his childhood. In a diary, his mother Lucy she recorded her hopes for her eldest son when he was just 6. "Charlie dear, be truthful and upright and morally brave. I should like you to be brave in every way, but I care far more for moral bravery than for any other. I do not want to see you a rich man or man holding a leading position so much as to see you a good, charitable man." Bean was 6 at the time. This moral philosophy aligned with the influence that the Arnold tradition had on the Bean family, especially through his father Edwin, who at this time was headmaster at All Saints College in Bathurst. Edwin had been a student at Clifton College, Bristol, under headmaster John Percival, a disciple of Thomas Arnold, the legendary headmaster at Rugby School. The Arnold tradition focused on muscular Christianity, gentlemanly behaviour and academic attainment, and emphasised the importance of character training, virtues such as loyalty, chivalry, sportsmanship, leadership, and above all, contributing to society. Now, Jeff Lindsay, who's here with us today, has done a wonderful paper that draws out more of the influence of the Arnold Society on Bean, and I really recommend the paper to you. The Bean family moved to Britain when Charles was 9. Edwin was headmaster at Brentwood Grammar. Charles and his 2 brothers were students there. It was natural that Charles would follow his father's footsteps to Clifton College. Charles was clearly influenced by both school and parental values. By the time he left for Oxford, the Arnold tradition had become the core of his belief system, and a sense of duty was deeply imbued in his psyche. He had long been taught to be a seeker of truth. During the Boer War, he was troubled by what he read of conditions in the concentration camps the British established there. So interestingly was John Percival. After Percival had fiercely criticised the conditions and loss of life in these camps, Bean followed suit. In a letter to the editor of the Pall Mall Gazette in October 1901, he took up not only the matter of the alleged high death rates, but the Gazette's manipulation of the figures involved. Taking a strong moral stance, he argued that publishing the truth would not harm any good cause, though suppressing it certainly would. This commitment to what he saw as truth would stay with Bean throughout his life. After 15 years in Britain and armed with classics and law degrees, Bean returned to Australia. He brought with him a sentimental familiarity juxtaposed with his British education. He was neither blow-in nor exactly dinky-die. He tried teaching, then the law, but found his natural introversion and timidity got in the way. He long had a strong urge to write, beset with the certainty that he had important things to say. A job as a journalist at the Herald followed. Now, the Herald assignment to the outback enabled him to see the shearer, the boundary rider, the riverboat captain with different eyes. He admired their resourcefulness, their grit. To Bean, they displayed a general determination to stand by one's mate and to see that he gets a fair deal, whatever the cost to oneself. May it long be the country's code, he exhorted. So this was a judgment of the attitude of Australians from the outback that stayed with Bean and certainly coloured his reporting during the war, as Martin Ball referred to earlier. From his years in Britain, Bean had become aware of the adverse impact of industrialisation. He saw the typical Englishman from Britain's industrial cities as small, pale and concave-chested, and again this image stayed with him. He compared the image with what he saw in the outback, concluding that Australian country life was unique and it had hammered out of the old Anglo-Saxon stock a new man. Bean described this new man thus: "He is a tall, spare man, clean and wiry rather than muscular. In face, a certain refined ascetic strength. His character is the simplest imaginable. The key to it is just this, that he takes everything on its merits and nothing on authority." Already a romanticisation has set in. Not only was Bean a social Darwinist who envisaged generations of city dwellers becoming smaller in body and weaker in courage and resolve than their forebears, he was also an idealist. His outback articles reflected the wide-ranging interests that caught the imagination of both Bean, the observer, and Bean, the budding social reformer. But his was not a vision of the Australian bush as a frontier to be conquered. He saw country Australia as an opportunity for a healthier lifestyle than industrialised Europe. He envisaged communities and cities and towns with parks and gardens and living in harmony with the environment. He even drew up a code for Sydney, emphasising the need for town planning to replace alarming ad hocery, which has unfortunately continued. They would have been wise to listen to him and his code. So here we have a man whose belief system was influenced by the Arnold tradition, a commitment to truth, who saw the health drawbacks of industrialisation and wanted to avoid them in Australia, and who embraced what he saw as the egalitarianism of the bush, something which was certainly in keeping with the Arnold tradition. Yet Bean also supported the White Australia policy because, he explained, he believed Australians did not want to be masters of other races. And anyway, Westerners and Easterners could not live together without demoralising each other. This was a prevailing attitude of the day. By the time the Great War began, Bean had established himself as an influential commentator through his articles for the Herald. He won the journalist's ballot, it seems by one vote, for the position as official war correspondent over Keith Murdoch. This appointment turned out to be fortuitous. Compared with the more sensationalist Murdoch, Bean was, while less flamboyant, nonetheless dedicated to accuracy. As far as he could possibly get to the facts, he would. He was relentless in that sense. However, his moral uprightness soon had him in trouble with the troops in Cairo, who were cooling their heels before the real action began. Urged on by General Bridges to write an article for the Australian papers about their rowdiness, Bean was given a hard time by the affronted troops. A chastened Bean took to his diary. I think the Australian will have to rely on the good things he does to wipe out the bad ones, and I think the sum will come out on the right side when it is all totted up. In this assessment, Bean was able to put personal criticism to one side to focus on the much bigger picture, prescient perhaps. Bean watched the men training rigorously in the heat and dust of Egypt, and it struck him that men from disparate parts of Australia were coming together to form not just an army, but as he saw it symbolically, a new nation. This hadn't really happened in the years since Federation in 1901. He was watching the seeds of mateship begin to take on a new dimension. This was in his thinking at that time, and it was reflected in the articles that he wrote back for the papers. When the fighting began at Gallipoli, Bean soon won back the respect of the man for the accuracy of his reporting. Apart from some grumbles that I'll come to, this remained the case for the war's duration. As a war correspondent, Bean had the combined benefit of legal training, experience as a journalist, and the capacity to maintain professional detachment. Truth was uppermost. The accumulation of facts, checking and cross-checking was second nature to him, as was not necessarily taking the word of General Headquarters. As the British correspondent Philip Gibbs observed, Bean regarded it as his bounden duty to see everything with his own eyes, or as Alice Ashmead Bartlett put it, we had this quote earlier today, but there's a point to it. Oh, Bean, I think he almost counts the bullets. This was truer than he realised, for at Anzac Cove, Bean admitted to trying to count the number of rifle shots he heard per minute as he compared one night's activity with another. And of course, he was shot at Criteria and carried the bullet in his leg for the rest of his life. In France, what Bean saw on the Western Front was beyond anyone's comprehension when the war began. This was merciless, industrialised killing. Among those who died was his own cousin, Leo Butler. Bean helped bury him. It caused him for once to admit that he felt inclined to get drunk myself. In his diary at Pozieres, Bean wrote of encountering a trench. In a trench, the ghastly sight of many dead Australians from the 10th Battalion. He noted, others that we came across you could hardly tell for dead. They might have been living men sleeping on the floor of the trench, and indeed the living were sleeping just near to them. One is apt to think that it is callous of the battalion to leave these men lying about, but the living are worn out by the morning, the dead are dead. In this entry, Bean adds, I can't bear to think of these things. It is possible that by August 1916, Bean's professional detachment, which had afforded, a degree of psychological protection, may well have progressed to a form of dissociation, a normal avoidant response to horror. As his friend Brudnell White noted at war's end, Bean faced death more times than any other man in the AIF. It is likely that Bean's rigid commitment to writing his diary daily unwittingly helped to debrief the horror. But in the final month of the war, it is clear that the impact of what he had seen had left its mark. Indeed, on the day after the war ended, Bean was moved to write. One doesn't get used to the peace in a day, and the old remaining anxiety and strain of war is still at the back of one's brain and will remain there till the world is itself again. Just 2 weeks earlier, on leave at Cannes on the French Riviera, he couldn't face having a beer with the boys. Instead, he felt compelled to sit in his hotel room, feverishly writing his 96-page treatise, In Your Hands, Australians. This was an extraordinary document. Bean knew better than anyone just what these men had been through, and in his book he set out his post-war vision for Australia, focusing on universal education, conservation, town planning and social planning more generally. He wanted to honour the memory of the dead. He wanted them not to have died in vain. This was Charles Bean, the utopian, the dreamer. But in this he hoped for too much. With 62,000 men dead and countless thousands recovering from physical and mental wounds, Australia had a broken generation. And then came the Great Depression. A disillusioned Bean would reaffirm his ideals 25 years later in his World War II book, War Aims of a Plain Australian. In this book, a sense of futility beset Bean, and he complained of an unfortunate deadness that had befallen Australia between the two wars. It was in this frame of mind that he attempted a book he planned to call The Straight Line, a book in which he used the third person to refer to himself, using the name John Percival, the former headmaster who espoused the Arnold tradition. He even had John Percival armed with his own trademark telescope at Third Eep in 1917. It seems that Bean was identifying with the moral philosophy that drove Percival, but in a war context, as he tried to make sense of it all for himself. He wrote, "Again and again on Gallipoli, or in billets in France, John, that is Percival, had thrashed out with his messmates the kind of Australia they might make it if only Australians devoted their brains and vigour to planning it as they planned operations in war. The new towns planned and old ones replanned by applying or inventing, where necessary, the principles of town planning to Australian conditions of climate and social equity." John wrote a small book in which he crystallised their hopes to that dreamland, which it would soon be in their hands to make or mar. He thought, if in that time we can't build something like the Australia that we all want, we don't deserve to possess her. The use of the third person is interesting, perhaps making it easier to write one step removed. I found this handwritten manuscript in the vast Bean archive at the AWM. Bean was tired. He was losing his way. The Straight Line was neither finished nor published. Also on his mind this time were the deaths of his friends Brudenell White and Harry Gullett in the Canberra air disaster in 1940. When he heard the news, the devastated Bean described in his diary how a light went out which has never been relit. This was another psychological hit. Amid these years of relentless and dedicated focus on writing the official history of the war, Bean met Effie Young, a nurse at Queanbeyan Hospital, not far from Tuggeranong Homestead, where he was living and working. Effie came from a more humble background, and when Charles proposed, she was unsure, telling him that she thought he would make a more learned and well-to-do squatter's. He would marry a more learned and well-to-do squatter's daughter. To Bean, such perceived gulfs did not matter. At age 41, he was finally able to give way to tender feelings he had denied for so long. There had been no room for frivolity, and he had been abstemious in every sense of the word. His courtship letters to Effie, or his nipper, as he called her, showed that he was now revelling in the warmth of a woman's affection. We could speculate that writing the official history over 23 years would unwittingly have helped Bean process the terrible events he bore witness to, another useful psychological protection. He almost certainly was affected by what we now know as post-traumatic stress. Bean's physician of 60 years, Sir Charles Bickerton Blackburn, noted in 1936 that he was very nervous and anxious. 12 years later, Blackburn's notes record that during World War II, Bean had a nervous tremor of hands and shaking head. Effie testified in 1964 that when they met, he was a sick man generally. She had no doubt that the war and the years of research that followed continued to take its toll. Before arteriosclerotic dementia set in around the mid-1950s, Bean revisited an issue that had long troubled him. In a letter to the Sydney Morning Herald in 1953, he wrote, "In my youth, it seemed to be almost universally believed that qualities such as courage or gentleness were in the blood of some peoples, and ruthlessness and savagery in the blood of others. The belief had become part of our language." Bean wrote that when he went to the Great War, the accepted belief was that something in the biological composition of the Prussians impelled them to brutality, and atrocities were a consequence of this. He continued, "It was not until, as a war correspondent, that I began to doubt the truth of this assumption. In World War II, the case was obviously very different, but whatever the cause of the dreadful happenings, it was definitely not a tendency to brutality inborn in Germans and Japanese and not, say, Englishmen or Dutchmen." In 1959, as he struggled to draft a speech for an approaching ceremony at the ANU, where he was to be awarded his second honorary doctorate, he tried to further set down his thinking, arguing that the course of history proved beyond doubt that blood had nothing to do with it. Leadership, tradition, and religion mattered more. As he put it, "My advice to our people and our poets would be to attach supreme importance to the national tradition and all that goes to make it." But the speech would not be given. Atop the page he wrote, "Draft of intended address not delivered because of overstrain." The letter to the Herald and the speech he drafted revealed the change in Bean's thinking that had taken place on race since the Great War, and particularly World War II. Race had, of course, seemed to play a part in his vexed relationship with General Sir John Monash, who was Jewish. Opposed to Monash's appointment as GOC AIF in France in 1918, Bean commented that Monash had the, quote, "ability, natural and inborn, in Jews to push themselves." This reference has encouraged perceptions that Bean was anti-Semitic. It was certainly a cultural prejudice reflective of the times and an attitude that Bean would come to reject. The real thrust of Bean's criticism of Monash was that ever since Gallipoli, he had seen him as a self-promoter. Such a personality trait was anathema to Bean, who was quiet, introverted, and modest to a fault. I found some interesting letters in the National Library in the Monash file that Monash wrote to his letter during the Gallipoli campaign, explicitly urging her to lobby the Argus to write his version of events. Monash believed Bean was not giving him due recognition in his cables. He explained that he didn't believe in, as he put it, hiding one's light under a bushel, and added any little discreet publicity may help to secure a recommendation for war honours. It is interesting that Bean knocked back the offer of a knighthood twice, and he believed he deserved such an honour no more than any soldier in the field. Bean later revisited his criticism of Monash and, with hindsight, could see that his appointment as GOC was justified by his successors in August and September 1918. While there was mutual criticism, after the war there was an unstated rapprochement, for they recognised they needed each other. Bean was writing the history and Monash had made it. In his own words, Bean saw himself as too self-conscious to mix well with the great mass of men, but behind that self-consciousness was a determination to do the job, to do his duty as he was taught was right. He was not infallible, but he never lost sight of that. Indeed, he was never a rich man, but he was a good man. A few years after Bean died, the former Governor-General Sir Paul Hasluck commented that he thought him, as he put it, rather self-consciously upright and with more tolerance than understanding of the wickedness of lesser mortals, such as politicians, public servants, and persons who saw their responsibilities in a way different from his way. If one accepts the aphorism that the child is the father of the man, then Bean's way was set early. He was someone born on the edge of the outback, plucked out at the age of 9 into the British public school system, and imbued with the spirit of Thomas Arnold. There was no greater example of Bean's dedication to duty than what he chose to do on the morning the war ended, 11 November 1918. Instead of joining the celebrations at Lille, where he was staying and for which he had no appetite, he drove to the battlefield at Fromelles and walked among the remains of the Australian dead. The Arnold tradition would have demanded no less. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Peter. Well, you know the drill. Mike, do you think he was anti-Semitic?
No, I don't. I think that I think the comment was that I quoted from his diary was motivated by this very obvious personality difference between him and Monash. He did not like Monash as a man. He had no respect for him in Gallipoli because he saw him as somebody who was not in the trenches with the men. I think this coloured his thinking on Monash all the way through, right until the end when he was able to see that, as he put it, he had to acknowledge that Monash had in fact succeeded when he was appointed to GOC divisional or corps level chief. As to the anti-Semitism, I think that the comments that that are there that I referred to about his changing attitude to race show that he long reflected on this issue and realised that he was wrong in his earlier thinking.
Michael Pickett.
Thanks. Peter, can I flip that question around and ask you why you think he's so admired, if not loved, Brudenell White?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, there's Brudenell White was the first person he met when he went to Victoria Barracks in Melbourne, and there was an instant rapport. Brudenell White had similar personality traits to Bean, and he guided Bean in those early days, and when they got to Egypt and then on to Gallipoli, he took advice from Brudenell White. He learned about military matters through Brudenell White's eyes, and so there was this similarity in personality that I think aligned them.
Andrew Richardson. You got to understand Bean as well as anyone in this time period possibly can through your biography. Do you, just on a personal gut feeling response, do you have any personal or professional criticism of Bean, his work or his legacy, how he approached things, or is it perhaps almost universal admiration and respect as seems to reflect a lot of the papers so far today?
Yeah, I think that he accepted very early on the restrictions that censorship imposed on him and worked within that framework. He certainly wasn't somebody who was going to challenge that, and in that sense, he was the right person to be appointed to that position. Whereas if Keith Murdoch had been the official correspondent, I think he would have worked to undermine the system as it worked. In terms of his writing, I think his article at Fromell is really quite interesting because as a trained journalist, as an experienced journalist, he would have known that the extraordinary casualty rate that the Australians suffered would have been the lead to the story, and yet he buried that fact in the very last paragraph. My thinking on that is that he reasoned this was the only way he was going to get past the censors, so that he could get this fact back to Australia that there had been this catastrophe. I think his writing can be a bit wooden. I was saying to Peter Burness, I think in many respects some of Bean's best writing is in his Western Front Diaries. I think there's some wonderfully emotive, descriptive material there, which allows us to get inside the mind of the man.
So do you think he had say that the casualty Fromell, do you think that how he approached the casualties at Fromell, was that a way to try and not get around the censor, but certainly not incur any sort of censorship on his article, or an idea that he didn't want to, he was thinking about the effect of that article and that reporting back in Australia, or whoever was reading it for domestic
I have no doubt that he wanted to get that information back to Australia. He was appalled by what happened at Fromell. I mean, he's when it came time to write the official history, he wrote something like I think it was 117, 120 pages in the official history on Fromell, whereas the British coverage of it amounts to 17 pages. And he argued long and hard with Edmonds about the capacities of Haking and indeed Gough at the Booyah Court, and forced Gough to drop his defence of both men. So I think right from the start he was appalled by this disaster. He knew where blame lay and wanted to get the essence of what had happened back to Australia, but he knew he couldn't write it as we would see it today in sensational terms. 5,500 Australians killed or wounded. He knew he had to play the system, and he did that.
Peter, can I ask two questions? The first one is, well, we know that Keith Murdoch didn't get the job, and we know what he went on to do. Can you just speculate, as if only for fun, is what you think Bean would have done had he not gone? What do you think he would have done in life, given the depth of your understanding of his personality? And the second question is, Stephen Ellis some years ago wrote a piece on the censorship of if that's what it is, of the naval volume. Have you found anything in Bean's papers or anything that you've discovered about him that might add to that story, so that if people wanted to take that issue on a bit further, they could from the documents that you've seen?
Yeah, I think Bean would have stayed a leader writer and feature writer at the Sydney Morning Herald, and probably written books about the Navy, more about the outback. He had actually planned a book on Aboriginal Australia, which his interest had been sparked by being part of a South Australian delegation that went to outback areas, and he actually had that marked down as a future project, but the Great War intervened, so it never came to pass. His interest, in fact, in Aboriginal affairs had been sparked by the earlier trip to the outback, and he wrote quite insightfully about the problems of frontier conflict that had occurred in earlier times along the Darling River and so forth. So far as censorship of the naval chapter is concerned, Bean, he probably, I think the documents show that he did accept that there was a need. I don't think he put up too strong a fight. I think Jose was slightly disappointed.
But you've not seen anything in the archives that would overthrow the view we already have of that? No, not in. Certainly, that's looking at the file on it in the archives. That I think that's there's nothing further there.
Anything over that side of the room? You're letting yourself down.
Chris Clark, just picking up a very intriguing thought that was inspired by Tom's question there. Let me preface it by saying it's always struck me that Bean gave in late in the war to what might have been seen, certainly today, as a journalist's instinct to not just report the news but want to be a player in shaping it. Could he have done what Keith Murdoch did and written a letter like Murdoch?
No, I don't believe he could have. He disapproved of the letter, but that was 1915. Certainly by 1918, he'd been long enough at the war to become drawn into the workings, the the way that intrigue was being played out, and of course he combined with Keith Murdoch to try and overturn the Monash appointment. I think he realised that he'd gone in too far. Certainly that's what the diary shows, that he'd overstepped the mark and realised that he was being outplayed and wasn't going to succeed. And indeed what he was he had envisaged was probably not the right thing to do. But by that stage, Murdoch had the bit between the teeth and he was dragging it along. But certainly he'd become a player, and I suspect that by that stage, Bean was really suffering, post-traumatic stress. He wanted the war over. He'd seen too many troops killed unnecessarily, and he was motivated by the view that the troops, as he put it, were safer under Brudenell White than they would be under Monash.
Michael McKernan. Peter, how did he cope with rogues? You've talked a bit about Keith Murdoch, and I think he would fall into that category at that time. Tom Blamey, when Gavin Long went to visit him when he'd been appointed official historian, told him that Bean had got it all wrong and that he had no idea of strategy and tactics. And yet Blamey had been with him on Gallipoli, he was in France, and Bean would have known Blamey quite well when he was appointed to command the Australians in the Second World War. Is there anything you've come across that would give us an indication of what he thought of Blamey?
No, I was hoping that I would find something that would shed some light on this, but unfortunately I didn't. His main, Blamey was with Monash, but Bean's focus during that time is all on Monash, and Blamey's just there. But he takes Bean for a walk around the woods at night and suggests he back off. But there's no criticism of Blamey. I think you'd agree with that, Peter? Yeah.
Well, the opposite didn't apply. Blamey regarded Bean as, I'm told that Blamey called Bean's writing a corporal's history.
Yeah. Yes, that's right. Yeah.
Chris and Bill. Actually, Bill then Chris.
Thanks very much, especially that very evocative final image that you gave. Just wondering, did return service people look to Bean as some sort of advocate for their well-being or how they were treated on return? Did he have any of that sort of role in later life?
Well, he was certainly highly regarded by returned servicemen. After all, he wrote 10,000 letters after the war, seeking information from various soldiers about their recollections. They looked up to him. There's no doubt about that. And he went out and spoke at Anzac Day ceremonies in places like the Lyceum Theatre in Griffith in 1932 or 33 or something or other. So he saw them as part and parcel of his group of friends. He was one of them. I'm not sure that he was able actually to advocate on their behalf, but he certainly did put their cause.
Coming back to Blamey's comment perhaps about a corporal's history, in his writing, Bean seems not to close with the essential problem faced by the British Army and, as a subset of that, the Australian Army in learning how to fight a continental war. An imperial gendarmerie, small professional army, basically gets itself wiped out by loose, then has to sort of build itself up again without most of its leadership cadre. They're all dead. there's no discussion of the problems they faced. How do you coordinate the artillery creeping barrage with the advancing infantry if you don't have any form of communicating with the infantry other than basically runners or semaphore? None of these higher problems of how you put a battle together are ever discussed. It's nice and easy to say Haking is an idiot, but was Haking mounting the learning curve as well? Was Haking just not lacking in the siege of command and control mechanisms to actually run the battle, or where did this all fit in, and how did the bunch of enthusiastic amateurs who stormed ashore at Gallipoli turn themselves into the essentially professional army that went in on the 8th of August? Incidentally, big secret on the 8th of August was that the Canadian Corps was going to be beside the Australians, so there were people other than the Australians on the Western Front. Some people have even said the French had an army.
Short answer to a long question.
Well, so far as Haking is concerned, Edmonds said to Bean, or wrote back to Bean, we knew he was no good after 1914 when he'd had an accident. I think it was. I quoted in the book. So Haking was not on a learning curve; he was on a declining curve at the time of Fromelles. As to how the army, the AIF, got it together, well, certainly they didn't have it together at Gallipoli, but they learned from it. That's
They didn't learn much by Fromelles.
I'm sorry.
The 5th Division was not much chopper. You know, yes, it's easy to blame Haking, and yes,
Yeah,
Haking
yeah.
was not the best.
Well, of course, this was the first engagement, and these were untrained troops who were being put into this. They were the new arrivals, of course.
We were the trained troops.
Well.
The Germans blamed the Australian officers for anything else.
Yes.
And
Yeah.
They said the troops were fine.
The German official history puts the blame on the Australian officers who didn't know how to lead their troops at that time. I think it's the fact that the Australian officers developed, and that's the point that Bean made. He said that people often assume that Australians wouldn't be led. Well, it's true they wouldn't be led by an officer whom they didn't respect, but
Precisely.
when they had officers who come up through their own ranks whose qualities they respected and who knew, they were very, very happy to be led by men that they respected.
Yeah, absolutely.
Sounds like a whole new conference. Can I ask you to thank Peter for that wonderful presentation?
Thank you.